or 6 miles away from where I am, 2,500 people. It's a Trump town. There are lawn signs all over the place, or there certainly were in 2016. And we have demonstrations in my town. It's great.
It's the same here. We've got a town of about 30,000 people. You might be somewhat familiar with the area. We're about 30 miles to the east of Gary, Indiana. We're about 60 miles to the east of Chicago. So just in between Gary, Indiana and South Bend, Indiana. We've got a community center over here that we've been using for organizing efforts and for cultural events to help sort of build a base here in the city. Our city's about 30,000 people, and we had a march 2 weeks ago that had, I think, 700 people come out.
That's incredible.
We've never seen anything like it.
Never seen anything like that.
No.
And, there's never been a demonstration in this little town of Millerton, ever, I'm sure. But there was the day before yesterday, so.
That's encouraging to hear. And I read in the Times that they're everywhere. There was like 3,000 different ones that they counted.
Yeah, and you also see it in the polls and in the people arrested. It's in all the statistics. You can't deny it. And nobody's really sure about why it's happening, but it's happening. And I think Trump deserves some of the credit for it.
I agree with you. We also live in, it's an interesting area here. So it's a Democratic city, but the region itself is, and even some of the Democrats who consider themselves Democrats here, they might be Republicans who just run as Democrats because the Democrats kind of control everything. It's a really weird situation where people sort of jump back and forth between parties depending on which party they think can get elected at that time. Mm-hmm. So we have that, but it's a Republican area. A lot of steel mills used to be in this region. We used to have like 120,000 steelworking jobs, union steelworking jobs in this region. Now it's down to like 22,000. So we've been hit really hard by deindustrialization. In 2015 and 16, we saw Trump signs everywhere, but we also saw Bernie signs everywhere. This last time around, and this will kind of bring me, I guess, to what would be one of my first questions for you is, in this current moment, we were going as hard as we could with the Bernie campaign 6 months prior to Super Tuesday. Super Tuesday happens. The campaign's essentially over. The pandemic hits. Then we have the economic fallout. Were you surprised by the state's response to the economic fallout and the pandemic, or were you not surprised that they were incapable of dealing with the pandemic and didn't respond to the economic fallout?
Well, the economic fallout was just the suffering of people. There was no rising of the people to force action by politicians. Now there is, but there wasn't really at the outset.
No, there wasn't any movement really towards the outset. I was somewhat surprised. I mean, we had a lot of our people were scared to go out. People were trying to figure out the pandemic. We were hearing from people who wanted to take to the streets, but they were concerned about this, concerned about that due to the pandemic. And then, I went back, of course, I started rereading and looking at poor people's movements, some of your other work that we've used in our organizing efforts, trying not to get in the way as organizers of this disruption, but trying to aid it as best we can. Mm-hmm. What did you make of when you saw these uprisings after George Floyd's murder? Did the scale surprise you? Did the fact that they were so multiracial surprise you?
Yeah, it all surprises me. It always surprises me. I mean, I may predict it, but it always surprises me when it actually happens. And it's so incredible that people have this reserve of hope and energy and bravery. It just always bowls me over. And this time too. But, it was it is different than any other movement I know of in American history. Partly it's the scale of the rising and its penetration into parts of the country that are not usually part of the rising. That's what we talked about a moment ago. But it's also that incredibly, it is deeply interracial. Now, how did that happen? Because, the fascist movement that Donald Trump has been organizing is organized around white superiority. That is its sort of main axis. And yet, when the opposition movement emerged, it emerged under the leadership of Black Lives Matter, and thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of young white people lying in the street in honor of blacks who were abused by the police. There've been interracial collective actions before. The rising in Los Angeles after the Rodney King murder was interracial, or it was at least Latino and Black. And, parts of the civil rights movement were interracial. But this, not on this scale and not with this sort of wholeheartedness. There's no nervousness about it. It's thoroughly interracial. And I think that must have something to do with youth culture, which just is not as racist as American culture has always been. It's the music and the sports and maybe even a little bit of history. But this is really great. This is so... We desperately needed something like this, or terrible things were happening, including not only the dismantling of our democratic institutions, which were, for all of their flaws, something we didn't want to see dismantled, and also the prospect of global warming and the way in which the fossil fuel industry was continuing to dominate policy. I mean, it was just terrible. And then came the movement. And we don't know what will come next, but it's put a halt to the destruction.
Were you surprised at the way that Americans responded to, say, some of the more militant actions? In other words, there was just a poll that was released that burning a police station is actually more popular than Joe Biden or Donald Trump.
I didn't see that.
They asked Americans, what percentage of you think the action of burning this police station was either somewhat justified or fully justified, and over 54% of Americans said either fully justified or somewhat justified, and those polling numbers are higher than either Joe Biden or Donald Trump, which is quite something.
That is remarkable. That is remarkable. I've been thinking about the nonviolence issue a lot in the last couple of days, because I've always been... I've sort of gone along with the nonviolence that movement scholars and organizers preach, but reluctantly, always reluctantly, because I know about the violence that was part of the civil rights movement. We celebrate it as the great nonviolent movement, all those young Black people bowing their heads and allowing themselves to be spat upon without resistance or without fighting back. Well, I mean, that's sort of the iconography of the civil rights movement, but it's not true. There was fighting back, and moreover, there were parts of the civil rights movement that don't get much acknowledgement or attention, like the Deacons for Defense, which were specifically dedicated to use violence to protect the movement. And always, the labor movement is a good example. Always, people have had to threaten violence or to act out violence in order to exercise their ability to disrupt. Disruption is not necessarily violent by any means. Mostly it's refusal, the refusal of cooperation. But when people threaten to do that, there is, of course, the violence of the state mobilized against them, and they have to respond. I mean, you think about the picket line. The labor. We know that labor strikes have always been accompanied by picket lines, and nowadays we think of picket lines as something like a dance. Everybody lines up in front of the gates, the factory gates. They have to maintain a certain distance between each picket. They have to be very orderly and so forth. It's all, the dance master is the court. The court organizes the picket line. But that picket line is a relic of what the picket line was all about. It was about people, working people, using the threat of brute force to protect their right to strike, to withdraw labor. That's what a picket line was. That's where it comes from, and that's what workers had to do in order to actually win the right to strike, to withdraw labor. So, I think there's a little bit of questioning now of the sort of religious doctrine of nonviolence, and that's a good thing because it's a false doctrine.
I agree with you, and I say that as a combat veteran. I say that as someone who's, since I got home from the war in Iraq in 2006 and joined the anti-war movement, have engaged in 14 years of these debates and discussions. And oftentimes I'm with you. I sort of am like, okay, look at the context. Let's see if this makes sense. A lot of times it would be like more, let me put it this way, Francis. I would usually dismiss some of those debates because they were usually coming from like hyper-sectarian left groups that had no connection to the community. As time has gone on and we see the kinds of people in our community and how they're responding, this is a very organic thing. This isn't something that like is ideologically driven. This isn't something that's driven by some sort of doctrine. This is just people, even for instance, in our city, 30,000 people, 600 of them take to the street. We organized the rally, but we left it open enough to allow people to sort of do what they wanted to do. And within 10 minutes into the rally, there was a 15-year-old young black girl who said, "Fuck this, let's take to the streets." And she started leading part of the protesters, and we shut down the whole eastern part of the east half of the city. And then marched downtown, and these kids did whatever they wanted. I mean, they were throwing rocks at the police. They were breaking up security vans at the local strip mall, which nobody likes them because they're always harassed, especially black people at the mall. And I was just amazed to see this sort of organic eruption of anger, and largely from teenagers and young folks, and black and white. And we did... none of us tried to do anything to stop that. But that came about organically. That wasn't like some sort of ideologically driven thing.
Mm-hmm. No, that's true. And, it does create a sort of connection. I don't know what I think of what I'm about to say. A connection between the looters and the protesters. Because, you think about the looters. What are they doing? They're doing what people have done for hundreds of years, and it's called the food riot in historical work. People have taken the stuff that they can't get because they're so poor. And,
Yep.
Why are we opposed to that?
I don't know. I don't agree. I'm not. I'm not.
Yeah.
I mean, because we live in a city of poor people. I mean, our city is straight up. We got 54% of people in this city who can't make ends meet. That was prior to the pandemic. That was before all this shit. We had 53%, according to the United Way, of people in our city couldn't make ends meet before this happened.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So we talk to people all the time about this shit. If people spent more time in the street with actual poor and working class people, I mean, I'm sorry to say this, Francis. I don't mean to, insult any of our friends or people we know on the left, but the reality is I was shocked by the way that so many of my friends who are progressive left thinkers, writers, activists, organizers, I was shocked at their response to this. And I would say to them, hey, look, man, you got to get the fuck out of Washington, D.C. or get out of the think tank or wherever you're at. You got to come to some of these cities. Go hang out in Ferguson, Missouri. Go hang out in Gary, Indiana. Go hang out in a suburb of Cleveland. Go see where people are coming from, and you wouldn't be so surprised that people are this pissed off and that people are ready to take these kind of actions and what it means to them. Not like it's fun to go grab extra toilet paper at the store. They literally can't afford the damn toilet paper.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
let me ask you about disruption and organization, Francis, because we've tried our best not to get in the way of disruption with organization, but I think we're dealing with this contradiction. We want to relate to both movements and elections, of course. Organization does seem like a key component to getting things done, but sometimes organizations hinder movements, and we're trying our best not to do that. So I think what we don't have today, that maybe the left had in the past, we don't have organized industrialized workers. Unionization is way down, of course. We don't have an organized communist party. And in many ways, we don't even have a really organized left. I mean, we do have groups like the DSA, and we can talk about that. But what we do have is sort of reignited unions, teachers and healthcare workers. Here, I'm thinking of Jane McAlevy's work. Black Lives Matter. We've got an environmental movement, but the movement, I think, is dominated by a lot of large NGOs. But we have interesting environmental justice things happening here on the front lines of those communities. And you've written in the past about how sort of turbulence is almost more important, or is more important than the numbers. Can you sort of talk about what you see right now, this sort of interplay between disruption and organization, and what your advice would be for people to sort of get out of the way or to help bolster those movements?
Well, I think there are certain tasks that organization is very useful at. For example, if the movement continues, if it picks up momentum, if it becomes bold, it needs protection. It needs lawyers. It needs bail money. That's a very good thing for organizations to do. A movement can't do that very well. It's hard for the movement to do it because you need to keep books, you need to collect money, you need to have lawyers on hand. I think thinking through the ways in which turbulent, bold movement on the streets has to be defended, and the kinds of activities that will defend it is, I think we ought to segregate, in other words, the movement part from the defense organization part, and work on, let the organizations be the defense. Work on the defense.
That makes sense. Do you see a role? What is the role of leadership in that, if at all? Is there a role?
There's a big role for leadership in both kinds of action. I think that, there are leaders in the sort of mass disruptions that seem to come out of nowhere and to be spontaneous. Of course there are leaders. People, there have been disruptive actions from time immemorial, and there have always been leaders because that's how people sort themselves out. They follow the people that they respect, that they connect with. So, but you need a somewhat different kind of leader to handle the bail money. You need somebody with organizational skills, with connections, with calm.
At what point do you think, is there a point, Francis, where the people who are, so we've got people in the street right now. I know this is going to vary depending on geographical location, where folks are located, whatever their cities or towns look like. But here, for instance, we had our big one-off event. There were a couple of events after that. We've been also focusing on tenants and fighting against the landlords because we're running up against the eviction moratorium, which ends for us on June 30th.
Mm-hmm.
How much, I guess the question I'm asking is, at what point is there a moment to try and get folks organized under some kind of a banner, or is it at all? Or is it that you just allow this to play out, do what you can on the organizational end to defend them, focus on the issues we would have focused on as an organization anyway, and then just kind of let the movement go as it's going and do the best we can to not get in the way?
Well, I think that the difficulty comes in trying to bring into the organization in some sort of formal role all or most of the participants in movement actions. I don't think there's anything, I think it's wise, in fact, to try to organize the most activist people in the collective action, in the riot, in the protests. And I think you can think of that as cadre organization. The Communist Party certainly did that. Didn't last very long, but then it had powerful opposition. And even though it didn't last very long, it really did create incredible networks that mattered, 40 or 50 years later. I have run into people who come from the South, black people who come from the South, who were organized into the civil rights movement by the communists who were in their church in Mississippi or in Louisiana. And since there weren't very many communists in the South, this is remarkable, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think it was in the 1970s, there was an effort to create a national student union in the United States. And I was the speaker at their second convening at Penn State. And they had arranged for me to sleep at the home of an associate dean of students, a black woman who had been friendly to the student movement. So she put me to sleep in a room with her grandson, and I'm an insomniac, so I don't sleep under those conditions. So I read all of the church tracts that were stashed in that room. And that the next morning, I asked her about that. I asked her about her connections to the church. And it turned out that she had been politicized in her church. I think it was Louisiana. And when she came to Penn State, she had connected with people in the state legislature, black people in the state legislature, who were also connected to these relics of the Communist Party in the 1930s. And that was how she came to defend the students who went on strike at Penn State in the 1970s.
Wow. Francis, do you think that it makes sense to have a party like that today, even if the party isn't, say, fielding candidates electorally?
I think, look, DSA is fine. I would just let that run its course, see where it goes. DSA is working on elections. It lends a lot of support, including people with particular skills to movement actions. I think it's doing fine. And I think DSA people probably believe in building a formal organization, but it's not interfering with what they're doing.
Right. Right. And they have an initiative right now with the UE where they're organizing on non-unionized workplaces.
Yeah. I think, it just breaks my heart when I hear about the UE. That is so incredible that they survived. You do know about the history of the UE?
Only a little bit. Please tell us.
Oh, well, it was a great union, and it was practically destroyed by the effort of the labor movement to create another union to sort of scoop up all the fruits of the organizing that the UE had done, and that was during the McCarthy period, and it looked as though that was going to succeed, that it would be part of the destruction wrought by the Taft-Hartley Act. But, on a small scale, in places here and there were UE cadres who stayed alive and continued to organize. And every time something important happens, they pop up. They're there.
Yes, they are.
I think that's just a very instructive story. I'm sure I don't know all of it. I don't know most of it because I don't know it from the inside of the UE. I just know what I observe.
They've been one of the best unions around, even through the anti-war period. They were part of the U.S. Labor Against the War Coalition, and they've been by far on the leading edge of any kind of progressive left movement in Chicago. Yeah. I know that for sure.
Yeah.
What do you think about workplace?
That's thrilling to me.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. I come from a union family, so it's to see any kind of union move. My dad was an iron worker, and most of my family are steel workers. But but both of those unions, unfortunately, during my time, they were very sort of reactionary unions. So I grew up with some decent class politics, was told not to trust the police, not to trust judges or, politicians and the rich and all this. But there was always a sense of the iron workers were going to fight for the iron workers primarily, and then everybody else came second. And that I was going to get straight into asking you about workplace organizing. We for our community center here and for our local organizing group, we read both your book, yours and Richard's book, Poor People's Movements, Why They Succeed and How They Fail. We also read Jane McAlevy's book, No Shortcuts, Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age. And we've been able to, because we're not a union, we're not able to apply all of those methods from McAlevy. So a lot of your work and hers sort of combined, but we are able to take a lot of those methods that McAlevy uses and try to apply them the best we can in the community context. But in the workplace context, there's been a tremendous amount of organization. And, under the McAlevy sort of model, this is always with the goal of striking. What do you think about some of the workplace organizing that's going on right now and the stuff that we've seen over the last just 2 years with teachers from West Virginia to Kansas to, even beyond?
I'm not sure I know enough about what goes on. I was struck by how little we knew about what the teachers had been doing and their relations with the community, which unfolded in a very positive way once the strikes started. And then, incredibly, these frail little unions that did exist started to take credit for the teachers' strikes. But there was a lot happening before that. It wasn't what Jane describes, and it wasn't, and we don't know about it. It seemed to be almost like a community coming together and realizing itself. What do you think about it?
Well, in Chicago, I'll tell you this, we went to a core, it was called CORE. It was like their caucus that they...
Yeah, I remember. That's the Chicago Teachers Union.
That's right. And we went, this was maybe 10 years ago now, maybe even 11 or 12 years ago, that we were in a small cafe in Chicago listening to some music, and there were, they had a small fundraiser. They were like so thankful just to have 20 of us in the room. I was there with Iraq Veterans Against the War Chicago chapter at the time, just to show support. And to see it grow from then until when the Chicago teachers started to go on strike several years ago has been something. I don't know how you can explain all of it, because simultaneously as that's happening and throughout those years, you have the occupation in Wisconsin in 2011. I think that raised people's consciousness. You have Occupy that took place in 2012. You have a series of events throughout Chicago around police murders, around immigrant rights, different electoral campaigns such as Chuy Garcia when he almost defeated Rahm Emanuel, leading all the way up through now these new waves of protests and movements. I think it's really hard to put together everything, but I do think one of the key components is that this community, there was a community base of people to reach out to. So in other words, if the Chicago Teachers Union was only operating on its own and they weren't in this context of other movements and other people in motion, when the Chicago Teachers Union was ready to strike, I don't know how effective that would have been, and I don't know how much control they had over creating the context in which that took place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, because I don't think that the unfolding of the great strikes in American history could have been predicted. That it was the coming together of currents in the community of workers, of their anger and their despair, and their sudden, there's always a combination of despair and a sense of power. There's a book by Jeremy Brecker called Strike. Have you read it?
I have not.
Well, it's about the major strikes in American history. It's very good. You should have a look at it.
I will.
It's also very empowering. It's a lovely experience to read it.
Oh, great. No, I will add it. I'll add it to my list. I will definitely add it to my list. You mentioned climate change earlier, Francis. One of the things, we face, I think all of us have been thinking about this. Organizing takes a long damn time. It takes a long time to build movements, takes a long time to build organizations, to build effective strategies, campaigns, all the rest. And then trying to interact with these explosions of movements that happen. What do you there's sort of a contradiction here because we're running out of time. How do you sort of approach, or what do you think about this interplay between the amount of time it actually takes to build these things up and the fact that we've got the climate scientists and everyone else that focuses on ecology and the environment telling us, look, time is running out. We have less and less time each year that passes, that we don't cut the carbon in the atmosphere, so on and so forth. How would you view, or what would be your advice for, I think, organizers, people thinking about this tension between the amount of time it takes to build effective organizations, movements, and the amount of time we have?
Well, it doesn't always take a lot of time. That's sort of Jane's model, where you talk to people one-on-one, and that takes a lot of time. But if you look at actual great strike upheavals, they come as surprises. They come as explosive outbursts of both anger and hope. And they're not the result of organizers talking one-on-one to every one of the workers who participate in the action. That's not how it happens. People have more volition. They have more audacity. They have more hope. They have more courage. they don't have to be just worked on by organizers. Organizers can help, but they help especially when they credit the volition and the autonomy of the people that they're working with.
So you see a difference there in terms of the way that you would view these strikes happening and the way that someone like Jane would.
Yeah, I do. I definitely do. And I think Jane is a little bit slippery on this issue, because I just got something. Oh, I got an article from her, presumably about her views, and she quotes me and stuff like that. But the article sort of tries to fudge the difference between a model of what happens that makes the organizer the central component, and the organizer talks to the workers, changes their views, runs stress tests and things like that. That model, and the model of the organizer who recognizes what's happening apart from the organizer's efforts and tries to escalate the capacity, heighten the capacity of the workers themselves, and heighten the and escalate the action instead of running a stress test.
This is interesting. See, I wish I could have had this conversation with you 2 years ago. I mean, because we're also, I say that and I laugh because how do I say it? We've been trying to bounce back and forth between trying to use as much of what we can find useful, as much as what we don't find useful, things that work in some contexts, things that don't work in others. But after seeing how this has played out over the last several weeks, it seems that your work resonates on a far deeper level with what we're seeing than even where Jane is coming from. And perhaps that has to do with the fact that we're largely operating at the community level and not as a union. Do you think that has maybe a little something to do with it?
Yeah, well, I think that, there are union people who recognize the distinctive dynamics of movements, but most union people don't. I remember being at a big union meeting in New York. There were people from most of the New York unions, especially the public sector unions, at the meeting. And everybody had come to hear from a delegation from Occupy. It was while the occupation of Zuccotti Park was still going on. And the people from Occupy spoke and so forth. And after they finished, there was dead silence in the room. And finally, somebody said, "You don't even do collective bargaining."
Oh. Jesus.
So the routines of the union had sort of overwhelmed their ability to recognize that something important was happening with Occupy.
Right. Right. We saw that locally.
Yeah.
Yeah, we saw that locally. I had USW guys that I've known for years who've been working in the steel mills, and like, what are these fucking hippies doing? And I'm like, oh, you guys. I'm like, come on, man. Like, you got to understand this is, trying to explain to them the generational differences, the class differences that, in our area, Francis, somebody who's working in the USW, they're making 80 to 120 a year. And that's a small percent. And I'm not, we know that they're not rich and so on. I don't want to portray this in the wrong way, but compared to the folks who are working 2-3 different jobs at gas stations, graduate in college with $100,000 in student loan debt, and then they end up working at the outlet mall for Coach or Ralph Lauren, making $10 an hour. Minimum wage in our state is $8.25. These were the people who were in the streets during Occupy. Even locally, we had people in some of these smaller towns, not nearly the scale that we see today, but there were local folks who were a part of no organization that just started showing up to gazebos in small town Indiana. No support from the
Yeah.
unions. In fact, the
Yeah,
unions told
yeah.
them, to get lost.
Yeah, I know. I went to a number of the occupations in New York I went to, but in Philadelphia, in Washington, D.C., and there were always poor people attracted to the occupation.
We're hearing the same from our friends in Seattle right now.
Well, what's happening there?
For the citizens autonomous, Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. They call it the CHAZ.
Oh, yeah, I heard about the autonomous zone.
We just interviewed a friend of ours who was there. He's another veteran we met through Iraq Veterans Against the War. His name's Graham Klumpner. He's a former Army Ranger, and he actually was sort of teaching and preparing people. So one of the things that's happening there is, of course, they've occupied these city blocks. They're holding events. They have soup kitchens. He told us that there's actually a significant amount of homeless and really poor people who don't have a place to go, who found that as like the safest place for them in the city. Because, other places they'd be getting kicked out, harassed by the cops, harassed by business owners. But also to the topic we brought up earlier, they've been under constant threat from right-wing groups, so armed right-wing groups. I'm sure you've heard about the protester who was shot in the shoulder in Seattle. This gentleman this right-winger drove his car into the crowd. This young black gentleman tried to stop him. He reached in the car to try and, pull the wheel or pull the brakes, whatever it was, and he got shot. There's been tons of threats. So what our friend Graham is there is sort of helping them. They're doing patrols there. So they have all of these nice things, 99% of it, of course, unarmed, nonviolent, holding events for children, educational events, soup kitchens, medical help. But they're also having patrols in the evenings. They have armed groups of people who are actually patrolling this zone to make sure that there's not right-wingers and others trying to infiltrate or harm anyone. So it's that's a pretty dynamic situation. That went.
Well, it raises a question we didn't touch on, which is what to do about the infiltrators, because there are a lot of them. You can be sure.
Yeah.
Just look at what happened to the Panthers.
Right. This is the big concern. What do you think we can do to avoid that best we can?
I think I can't think of what you can do to avoid it. I think you have to move ahead no matter. I don't think you can avoid it. What are you going to do? You're going to interrogate everybody who is curious and wants to learn what you're doing?
Right.
You're going to do investigations?
Yeah. And turn them off real quick.
Yeah.
That makes sense. What do you think are some of the key sectors to disrupt right now? You're looking at this economy. What do you think are some of the key sectors of the economy that we can be disrupting?
The banks and fossil fuel. The banks especially. Because they're very fragile. I mean, they are, they're so over-leveraged.
And the fossil
And, rent's coming due.
Yep. Yes, it is. That's what we're trying to gear up for. We've got June 30th is when our moratoriums run out for these evictions. We're expecting, there could be thousands of people kicked out.
People are going to be ready to defend against evictions.
Yes. Yep. And what role do you see for an organization in that regard? In other words, we might have people within our organization who are going to be defending against their own eviction. But then there's going to be people in the community who aren't affiliated with our organization. Does this get right back to bail money, lawyers, getting the word out?
That's one kind of thing that an organization can do. But, in the 1930s, the Communist Party organized, well, you could call it organizing. They organized to defend against eviction by just having information networks about where the sheriff was going to do the eviction, and then marching through the streets. They were called black bugs because they marched through the streets and they called people out to come to the multifamily building where the eviction was occurring, and to put the furniture back as quickly as the sheriff's people took it out.
Yep.
And they did it. And they stopped evictions in Chicago. They stopped evictions in a number of cities.
That's exactly what we're trying to get people geared up for now.
Well, you have to be prepared for that. You have to. It's not a complicated organizational task, but you do have to be prepared for it. You have to have the network in place that will tell you where the eviction is likely to occur. You have to be able to have the troops marching down the street, calling people out. And you have to be able to fight the police or the sheriff's people.
Yep. And do you think it matters who does that, Francis? In other words, do you think it has to be the people who are getting kicked out to fight those police? What is the role?
No, they have to be in favor of it, but not. They have to be grateful for the support, but it doesn't have to be them.
That makes sense. What are these moments do you see that could be for, you call it strategic escalation? Is there a science to this at all, or is most of this just reading the moment, reading the people you're around, and deciding to take that action?
There's no science. I don't know what the science would be. There are scientific elements to it, in the sense that if you're organizing a debtor's strike, you want to know how highly leveraged the banks are that are lending the money. You want to know to whom they're lending money. You want to know, for example, do they have big loans out to local governments or school districts? And have they violated the law in making those loans? Because they're usually supposed to be to take into account the public purpose of the organization to whom they make the loan. So you want to be well informed. And there are people that can inform you. There are people who have developed a lot of knowledge about finance and banking as a result of the 2008 financial crisis and the number of homes that were foreclosed on. So, but you have to prepare. You have to find those people and get them to work on your problem, your city, your bank.
Right. What, in terms of organizations and movements, do you think that there's too much emphasis right now that groups are trying to place on, say, building those types of organizations as opposed to getting in the streets, causing problems, disrupting? In other words, the amount of time we spend holding meetings compared to the amount of time of just going out and doing something, seeing what the response is, causing some disruption.
Well, I mean, are the meetings fun? Do people like to come to them?
Sometimes no.
You?
Yeah. Sometimes, but sometimes no. In other words, the thing that I see too, Francis, is that there's a lot of people that are, we would call them ordinary folks. They don't self-identify as anything. They're just going to work, doing their thing. But they have more questions, I think, sometimes than, like when they hear that something's going on, they'll want to come out and get a sense of like, hey, what the hell are you guys all about? What are you doing? But they don't necessarily want to be officially affiliated with stuff. It's like, we're glad to know that there's an organization out there doing this. And one of the benefits...
Well, don't put too much emphasis on making them join the organization. If they come to the meetings, that's fine. They're part of it.
Right. Right.
Why do you need members?
Why do we need them?
What?
Did you ask why do we need them?
Why do you need members? Why do people have to become formal members?
Yeah, so you can, I mean, I guess the theory would be that you would get more people to bring them in, you know, that they could feel like they're actually bought into this thing and they have some say-so in the way that it goes.
You can do that without making them formal members. You can make them owners of the actions by giving them responsibilities, crediting them with what happens. There are a lot of ways to give people a sense of ownership without, you know, making them formal members. Or make them formal members. If those who want to become formal members can become formal members. I don't think it matters much.
Okay. That makes
ownership. It's your organization, and you did it. You and your friends and your relatives and your family and your...
Right. What do you think about the relationship? We've been holding back because we don't want to mention anything that would turn anybody off, but I've been seeing other groups trying to pressure some of these folks who are in the streets now, you know, to focus on the election and all this kind of stuff, and it's really not what people want to hear, the people that we know in the streets. They don't want to hear that shit.
Well, you find out if they want to do it. In some places, they do want to do it.
Right.
In some places, the protests have apparently readily turned toward voter registration or some electoral kind of thing. But if people don't want to do it, why should they do it? It won't. You can't make them do it. It'll be a very bad experience for them and for you.
So just read where people are at.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
I mean, it might be an election that is exciting. It might be, you know, AOC or somebody who people love, but it might not be. So.
Right. I was thinking specifically about the presidential election, but there's not too many people I know who are excited about this right now.
Well, you know, I thought for a long time, I thought that Trump was going to refuse to step down even if he lost the election. I thought he could well lose it, but he wouldn't give it up because he'll go to jail if he does. But now the polls are showing he is so unpopular that he may have to. He may have to step down. I mean, the military won't defend him, I don't think.
No, that's the sense that I get. I think the military is much more interested in stability, and they have their own interests in mind, and I think that
and they have a lot of black people in the armed forces.
Yep.
They have to worry about their morale.
That's right.
Look at what happened when the rank and file of the military lost morale in Vietnam. I mean, the military almost lost control of what was going on.
That's right. I was thinking of that as the sailors on the Theodore Roosevelt cheered as their admiral was walked off the side of their ship to go face whatever administrative consequences he faced for speaking out about COVID. Do you remember that, Francis?
Yeah, I do.
I was thinking of that moment as well. I mean, I think
that was a very good moment for the military. It was good for them. That's what they need. They need to restore morale to the troops because they took a terrific beating during the Vietnam War.
Well, even Iraq and Afghanistan.
How many officers were killed by their men?
Oh, you mean from fragging?
Yeah.
Yep. Well, even think about this. I mean, we've been at war now, Francis, for 19 years. My friend Sergio and I, he's behind the sound machine right now, making everything happen. Him and we were in the same platoon together in the Marine Corps. Mm-hmm. And we know guys who've been on 4, 5, 6, 7 different tours. I mean, I think it's not talked about because the intensity isn't what it was in Vietnam. There's no question about that. but it has been 19 straight years of combat deployments for a lot of these units. I mean, the U.S. military's morale is low now. It's not comparable to what it was in 1972 or anything like that, but the morale is low, and we get those reports from people we know who are still in the military. Not to mention the demographics, like you said. I mean, we had a platoon filled with, especially we had a lot of Mexican cats in our platoon, and we had a ton of Mexican guys in our platoon. So
that's an interesting aspect of what's going on now.
I mean, even
important.
The need for GI resistance right now.
Yeah, well, I think the need for the military to hold itself apart from the fascist Republicans and their big economic backers. We don't want them to control the military.
Right. One of the things I was going to say in response to your comment about Trump is the way that I kind of read this, and this could be way off, but the way that I read Trump is that he wouldn't mind leaving because he's got the ability to make a ton of money when he leaves. I mean, when he leaves this office, the amount of books, media, whatever he decides to do, he's going to make an insane amount of money, and he's not going to be constrained in terms of what he wants to say. Not that he's too constrained now. That was my sense. My sense was that he might be temporarily embarrassed, but the way that the right-wing propaganda machine goes, they could probably spin this in whatever, even if he legitimately loses, they're going to spin it as though it was illegitimate and maybe he was pushed out of office and he's a victim somehow of the great liberal elites or the radical left or whatever they want to say. That was the sense that I got. Because I understand what you're saying, and a lot of other people who I respect have said the same thing, that they're concerned about him not leaving. My sense was that he's self-interested enough to leave, but that could be wrong.
But he's making a lot of money while he's in office. He's making more money than he made before. Also, I think he has to worry about both lawsuits and criminal charges if he isn't protected by being the president.
You think they would bring criminal charges against him, Francis?
Well, I don't think the Justice Department would, but I do think that there are state and regional attorneys who would. In New York, for example.
Right.
Or California.
Strategically, though, you think it makes sense to get this guy out? I mean, obviously, people are having this debate on the left right now. We agree that it makes strategic sense to vote this guy out, but that's your position with him, obviously.
Oh, yeah, I want to vote him out, but I don't know if my vote will be counted.
Right. In which case...
So I need a plan B.
Right. Which is probably a Mubarak situation, right?
A what kind of situation?
Like an Arab Spring with Mubarak, where if he does...
yeah.
I mean, if he doesn't leave, it's going to literally be, we just have to be in the streets until this guy leaves.
Yeah. Well, I don't quite know how long we'll have to be in the streets. I don't quite know how that will play itself out. I mean, people want to talk about it with me, but I don't know.
Right. Well, Francis, I've taken an hour of your time, and I'm sure that that's probably way longer than you thought it was going to go, so I apologize.
No, I didn't know how long it would be, and I didn't worry about it. And it's a pleasure to talk to you, and stay in touch. Okay,
I will. If you don't mind, I mean, I really would like to be able to stay in touch with you in terms of what we're doing. Even if you send me, I won't blow up your email, Francis, but even if I could send you something every now and then in terms of what we're doing, just to get your advice.
Please do.
Okay.
Please do.
That's okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. I can't tell you how much it means to us. We respect you and your work more than we can tell you. So we appreciate this. That's very nice of you to say. Anyway, we'll be in touch. All right. Thank you, Francis.
Bye.
Take care. Hey, thank you for watching and listening. If you think this program is worth a pack of cigarettes or a cheeseburger, you could become a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. The link is available at our website, parcmedia.org. That's PARCmedia.org. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Also, you could find us on Instagram at Park Media, Facebook at Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, and you could find me on Twitter at Vince Emanuele.